The morning Fannie Hawkins walked into the Silver Spur saloon wearing that blue dress. Every man in Caldwell, Kansas stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds. It was the summer of 1879, and the cattle town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, a place where the air smelled of leather and trail dust, and the particular kind of hope that comes from starting over. The town had grown fast in recent years, swelling with drovers and merchants and homesteaders, all pressing their luck against the wide open sky of the Kansas prairie. There were good people here, and rough ones, and plenty who fell somewhere in between, all of them living their lives at the pace that the frontier demanded, which was fast and unforgiving and occasionally beautiful. Fannie Hawkins was 23 years old, the daughter of the town's only banker, and she had the kind of face that painters would have wept to capture on canvas. Her hair was the deep brown of good river soil, and her eyes were the exact shade of a Kansas sky just before a summer storm rolls in from the west, not quite gray, not quite blue, but something in between that made you want to keep looking to figure it out. She was educated by the standards of the time, having spent 2 years at a finishing school in St. Louis before her mother took ill and called her home. She was clever, she was warm, and she was, by the unanimous agreement of every soul in Caldwell, Kansas, the prettiest woman in town. She had not, until that particular Tuesday morning in July, ever set foot inside the Silver Spur. Young women of her station did not make a habit of saloon visits. But Fannie Hawkins was not a woman who let station dictate everything, and she had a purpose that Tuesday morning that had nothing to do with whiskey and everything to do with a man named Roscoe Yates. She had heard about Roscoe Yates the way you hear about weather, which is to say that people talked about him before he arrived and kept talking after he left. He had ridden into Caldwell 3 months prior with a small cattle drive from Texas, delivered the herd to the stockyards with clean books and not a single animal lost, and then, instead of riding back south like the other drovers, had stayed. He had taken work at the Bellamy Ranch, about 4 miles east of town, and quickly established himself as the best hand old Calvin Bellamy had ever hired. He could read land and weather the way other men read newspapers. He could gentle a spooked horse with just his voice. He was honest to the point of bluntness and capable enough that his bluntness was forgiven. He was also, and this was the part that had gradually made its way to Fannie's particular attention, 26 years old, broad-shouldered and possessed of a quiet quality that felt like still water, deep and clear, and not easily disturbed. She had seen him twice at the general store, once at Sunday service, and once at the Independence Day picnic where he had politely helped retrieve her mother's hat when the wind took it across the churchyard. Each time they had exchanged the sort of pleasant, brief words that constitute the polite social currency of a frontier town, and each time Fannie had found herself thinking about him longer than the conversation warranted. She had decided, in the direct and practical way that was her nature, to simply make her intentions known. It was this decision that had brought her through the doors of the Silver Spur at 9 in the morning, when the establishment was quiet enough that Roscoe Yates sat alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee, and what appeared to be a letter he was reading with a great deal of careful attention. He looked up when the door opened, and something shifted in his expression when he saw her. He rose immediately, the way a man does when he has been properly raised, and he reached up and pulled off his hat. "Miss Hawkins," he said, "good morning. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," she said, crossing the room with the kind of composure that had taken her years to cultivate. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all," he said, though his eyes dropped briefly to the letter in his hand before he folded it and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt, close to his chest. "Can I help you with something?" Fannie sat down across from him without being invited to, which was itself a statement, and she looked at him directly. "Mr. Yates," she said, "I will not waste your time or mine with roundabout conversation. There is a church social this Saturday, and I would like to attend it with you if you are willing." There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, but it felt considerably longer. Roscoe Yates looked at her with those steady gray eyes of his, and something moved across his face that she could not quite name. It was not disgust, and it was not disinterest. It was something gentler and more complicated than either of those things, and it landed somewhere in the vicinity of sorrow. "Miss Hawkins," he said, and his voice was careful in the way of a man choosing each word individually, "I am genuinely honored by that. I mean that sincerely. You are a remarkable woman, and any man in this town ought to consider himself fortunate beyond words at such an invitation." Fannie watched him, waiting. "But I cannot accept," he said quietly. "And I am sorry for it." She had not expected that. She had prepared herself in a general way for the possibility of hesitation or shyness or some social awkwardness, but she had not prepared herself for a simple, honest, gentle refusal, and for a moment she simply looked at him. "May I ask why?" She said because she was Fannie Hawkins and she was not the sort of person to leave a question unasked. He was quiet for a moment. His hand went, briefly and unconsciously, to the pocket where he had tucked the letter, pressing against it through the fabric of his shirt. "Because my heart is already spoken for," he said. "That is the honest truth of it, and you deserve an honest answer." Fannie Hawkins rode home from the Silver Spur Saloon with her chin up, and her expression perfectly composed, and a feeling in her chest that was not quite hurt, and not quite confused, but some combination of both that she could not immediately sort through. She was a woman of intelligence and honesty, and the intelligence part of her acknowledged that there was something deeply respectable about a man who turned her down for that reason, rather than offering some hollow excuse. The honesty part of her acknowledged that it stung considerably more than she had anticipated. She spent the rest of the day helping her mother with the household accounts, and trying not to think about the way Roscoe Yates' hand had pressed against his shirt pocket, against that letter, with the automatic gesture of a man protecting something precious. His heart was already spoken for. She turned the phrase over and over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight and edges. By Thursday, she had convinced herself that she had put the whole business aside. By Friday, she knew she had not. It was on that Friday afternoon, while she was at the general store helping her mother select fabric for new curtains, that she overheard a conversation between Martha Greeley, the postmaster's wife, and Dolores Finch, who knew everything about everyone in Caldwell and considered this a public service rather than a vice. "That Yates man," Dolores was saying in the careful loud whisper that was her preferred mode of communication, "gets a letter from Austin, Texas every 2 weeks without fail, has been getting them since he arrived. I have seen the return address myself." "Maybe he has family there," Martha offered. "Maybe," Dolores said, in a tone that communicated vast skepticism. "Or maybe he has a sweetheart he left behind. That would explain why he never so much as looks at any of the women here, pretty as some of them are." Fannie kept her face carefully neutral and pretended to be absorbed in a bolt of calico. A sweetheart in Austin, Texas. A letter carried close to his heart. A refusal delivered with sorrow rather than indifference. The pieces arranged themselves in her mind with an almost audible click. She told herself, firmly and with considerable conviction, that this was none of her business. Roscoe Yates was a free man, and whatever arrangement he had with whoever waited for him in Austin was his own private affair, and Fannie Hawkins was not the kind of woman who pined after unavailable men like a character in a penny novel. She spent the next week being very busy and very efficient and very firmly not pining, and she managed this fairly well except for the occasions when she caught sight of Roscoe Yates in town, which happened with what she considered an unreasonable frequency for a man who spent most of his time on a ranch 4 miles away. He always nodded to her with a politeness that held, she thought, a particular quality of care, as though he was trying to convey something courteous and regretful in the gesture. She nodded back with an equal politeness that she hoped conveyed that she was perfectly fine and had not thought about him at all. the situation might have remained in this pleasant, manageable state of mutual polite fiction indefinitely, except that 3 weeks after the incident at the Silver Spur, the stagecoach from Austin, Texas arrived in Caldwell carrying, among the usual mail and supplies, a young woman named Clara Webb. Fannie first saw her on a Wednesday afternoon. Clara Webb had just stepped down from the stage and was standing in the middle of the main street looking around her with the wide, wondering eyes of someone seeing a place for the first time. She was perhaps 21 years old, slight and fair-haired, with the kind of quiet prettiness that doesn't announce itself loudly but takes hold of you slowly. She was carrying one carpetbag and had the look of a person who has traveled a very long distance with a very clear destination in mind. She asked the stagecoach driver something, and Fannie, standing near the post office, watched the driver point toward the road that led east out of town, toward the Bellamy Ranch. Fannie felt something she was not proud of feeling, which was a sharp, quick, possessive ache that had no business being there given that she had no claim whatsoever on Roscoe Yates, had known him for all of about 4 minutes total, and had been turned down by him flat. She identified this feeling with her characteristic honesty, found it somewhat embarrassing, and then found herself crossing the street anyway because Clara Webb was a stranger and a young woman alone, and Caldwell could be a rough town, and whatever else was true, those facts warranted common decency. "Excuse me," she said. "You are new to Caldwell. Can I help you find something?" Clara Webb turned to her with a smile that was a little tired around the edges but genuine all the way through. "That is very kind," she said. "I am looking for the Bellamy Ranch. I understand it is east of town." "It is," Fannie said. "About 4 miles along the main road. Do you have someone expecting you there?" "I do," Clara said, and something in her expression softened in a way that was unmistakably the look of a woman thinking about a man she loves. "Roscoe Yates. He is expecting me." There it was. Fannie Hawkins was a good person, and being a good person meant that she did what she did next, which was to offer Clara Webb the use of her family's buggy and horse to make the trip out to the Bellamy Ranch, as there was no livery rental available at that hour. Clara accepted with grateful surprise, and Fannie found herself driving east along the sun-baked prairie road with Clara Webb sitting beside her, and the whole world feeling a little tilted on its axis. They talked during the drive, because silence would have been awkward, and Fannie Hawkins did not do awkward if she could help it. She learned that Clara Webb was from Austin, that she had been waiting these past months to save enough for the stagecoach fare, that she had been corresponding with Roscoe since he left Texas, that she had come because she could not bear to wait any longer and because she and Roscoe had an understanding between them. "How long have you known him?" Fannie asked, keeping her eyes on the road. "Since I was 16, Clara said. "He worked for my father's ranch. He left when I was 18, said he needed to make something of himself before he could ask anything of me properly. I told him that was foolish. He said it was important to him." She paused. "He has always been like that. He takes care of everything quietly and thoroughly and never asks for anything he hasn't earned." Fannie thought about a man who turned down the prettiest woman in town, gently and honestly, because he had already given his heart to someone else. She thought about a letter carried against a man's chest like something sacred. "He is a good man," she said, and she meant it, and it cost her something to mean it, and she meant it anyway. "He is the best man I have ever known," Clara said simply. When they arrived at the Bellamy Ranch, Roscoe Yates was in the yard mending a fence post when he heard the buggy approaching. He looked up, and Fannie watched from the driver's seat as his whole face changed the moment he recognized who sat beside her. It was not a dramatic change. He did not shout or run. He simply went very still for a moment, the way a man does when something he has been hoping for finally arrives, and the reality of it is more than even hope had prepared him for. And then he set down his tools and walked toward them with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who is trying to make himself believe this is real. "Clara," he said, and that one word held more weight than most speeches. She was off the buggy before it had fully stopped, and he caught her, and for a moment Fannie was invisible, which was exactly as it should be. Roscoe looked up over Clara's shoulder and met Fanny's eyes. His expression held everything that could not be said aloud, which was the gratitude and the awareness of what she had done, and the recognition of what it must have cost her, because he was a perceptive man who had not been unaware of her feelings even as he had been unable to return them. "Thank you, Miss Hawkins," he said quietly. "Don't mention it," she said, and turned the buggy around. She drove back to Caldwell with the late afternoon sun in her face and the prairie wind in her hair, and a feeling in her chest that was sad and clean at the same time. The way things sometimes are when you do the right thing at some cost to yourself. She was 23 years old and the prettiest woman in Caldwell, Kansas, and she had just personally delivered the man she had been thinking about for a month to the woman who actually had his heart. She thought about what Dolores Finch would say when she heard the story, which she inevitably would. She thought about what her mother would say. She thought about the church social on Saturday, which she would now attend alone or with a group of friends, and would be perfectly fine either way. She had just about finished compiling a sensible and dignified account of her feelings when she nearly ran the buggy into a horse that was standing in the middle of the road. The horse was not alone. Beside it on the ground sat a man with his back against a fence post, and his left hand wrapped in what appeared to be a strip torn from his own shirt, the white cloth darkening steadily with blood. He was perhaps 27 or 28, lean and dark-haired, with a face that was sharp and angular and currently arranged in an expression of concentrated effort as he attempted to tie a knot one-handed. Fanny pulled the horse up hard and set the brake. "Are you hurt?" she called, which was an obvious question given the blood but seemed like the appropriate starting point. The man looked up. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black, and they assessed her with a quick, direct intelligence that was not quite what she had expected given the circumstances. "Badly enough to be grateful for the question," he said. "My horse threw me about a mile back when something spooked her in the grass. I landed on a piece of wire. I have the wire fenced in now for what that's worth." His voice had an educated quality beneath the roughness of it, and there was a dry humor in his answer that surprised her. "Let me see it," she said, because she had been the one who tended to every cut and fever in the Hawkins household since her mother's health had declined, and she knew enough to know that a hand wound that bled through an improvised bandage warranted attention. "I assure you, miss, I am managing," he began. "You are not managing," she said, climbing down from the buggy with the medical kit she had had the foresight to begin keeping under the seat the year before, because Caldwell was the kind of place where a medical kit in the buggy was a practical decision rather than an anxious one. "Sit still." He was quiet while she unwound his improvised bandage and examined the cut, which was deep but clean and had missed anything critical. She cleaned it with carbolic solution from her kit, which made him hiss through his teeth but hold very still, and she bandaged it properly with her own clean linen strips. "You're good at that," he said. "I have had practice," she said. "What is your name?" "Eli Calhoun," he said. "I am heading to Caldwell. I have just taken a position at the newspaper there. I am to be the new editor of the Caldwell Courier." She looked up from the bandaging. "We have been expecting a new editor for 2 months," she said. "Old Mr. Barnes retired in the spring." "I got delayed," he said, and something moved across his face quickly, some private thing he didn't elaborate on. "And you are?" "Fannie Hawkins," she said. "My father is the banker." "Are all bankers' daughters in Caldwell this competent in a medical emergency?" he said. "Only me," she said. "Can you drive a buggy one-handed? Because if not, I will take you into town and someone can come back for your horse." He looked at his bandaged hand and then at his horse, who had wandered back and was watching the proceedings from a distance of about 10 feet with the vaguely apologetic air of a horse who knows she has caused trouble. "I think between me and Daisy there we can manage," he said. "Daisy," Fanny repeated. "She seemed like a daisy when I got her," he said. "She has since proved otherwise. We are working through it." It surprised her into a laugh, which was the first genuine laugh she had managed all afternoon, and she heard it with a kind of startled relief. Eli Calhoun caught his horse, and they rode the last mile and a half into Caldwell together, Fannie in the buggy and Eli on horseback slightly behind her, and they talked easily the way people sometimes do when they have just been through a small shared crisis, and the adrenaline has given way to the pleasant ease that follows it. He had come from St. Louis, she learned, where he had worked at a larger paper before an opportunity at the Courier had drawn him west. He had a quick mind and a way of asking questions that made you want to answer them thoughtfully, not because they were intrusive, but because they were genuinely curious. He asked about Caldwell, and she described it honestly, the good and the complicated, the commerce and the roughness, the community that was building itself out of dust and determination. "You like it here," he said. It was not quite a question. "I do," she said. "I didn't always when I first came back from St. Louis, but I have come to see that there is something worth building here, something real." "I can use that," he said. "About the town, in the paper." "You had better not quote me directly," she said. "I have a mother to consider." "I will be appropriately anonymous," he said, "a prominent local resident." "You have not even been here an hour and you are already collecting material," she said. "Occupational habit," he said, without the slightest apology, which she found entirely reasonable. She left him at the door of the Courier office, where he had a key and arrangements already made for lodging above the press room. He thanked her for the bandaging with a seriousness beneath the lightness that told her it was genuine. "Welcome to Caldwell, Mr. Calhoun," she said. "Thank you, Miss Hawkins," he said. "I expect I will be seeing you." She drove home through the golden afternoon light of the Kansas summer and realized with some surprise that the tight, sad thing in her chest had loosened considerably. She did not analyze this very much. She went home and helped her mother with supper and set the table and talked about the new editor of the Courier in the most casual possible way. And her mother, who was a perceptive woman hampered only by intermittent health, said nothing, but looked at her daughter with a particular quiet attention. Eli Calhoun came into her father's bank on Thursday morning to establish an account and discuss the advertising rates that local businesses paid to the Courier, which put him in the building where Fannie worked as her father's bookkeeper. This was not a surprise. Caldwell was a small enough town that a new arrival made a circuit of its institutions within the first week. What was a surprise was the quality of the conversation they fell into while waiting for her father to finish a meeting. It ranged from the political situation in Kansas to the habits of the Texas Longhorn to a book Fannie had read the previous winter that Eli had also read, and his opinions on it were wrong in a way that was interestingly and specifically wrong, so that arguing with him was considerably more entertaining than agreeing with him would have been. Her father, emerging from his meeting to find his daughter in animated debate with a stranger about the literary merits of a 3-year-old novel, regarded this scene with the alert attention of a man who has been wondering when his daughter might find someone worth debating. "You are the new editor," he said to Eli. "Yes, sir. Eli Calhoun." "I apologize for the argument." "Don't apologize," Josiah Hawkins said. "She hasn't argued like that since St. Louis. Come in and let us talk about that advertising rate." Fannie went back to her ledgers with the distinct impression that her father had just intervened in a chess game and moved a piece significantly forward, and she was not entirely sure how she felt about that. She decided after careful self-examination, mostly pleased. The weeks that followed arranged themselves into a pattern that became, gradually and then quite decisively, the most interesting weeks Fannie Hawkins had spent in Caldwell since her return. Eli Calhoun was establishing the Courier as a genuine news organ rather than merely a bulletin board for local announcements, and this project brought him into contact with everyone in town, including Fannie, who was one of the most informed people in Caldwell by virtue of being her father's bookkeeper, and by virtue of having the kind of listening presence that made people tell her things. He came to Sunday service, where he sat 2 rows behind her, and once caught her eye during the sermon and made a small, barely perceptible expression that commented on the particular passage being preached, and she had to press her lips together to keep from responding visibly. He came to the Saturday market on 3 consecutive Saturdays, where he talked to merchants and farmers and drovers, and wrote things in a small notebook with a speed that impressed her. He asked her opinion on things, regularly and specifically, not as a courtesy, but because he actually wanted to know what she thought, which was an experience that Fannie found startling in its rarity and pleasurable in its consistency. She found out more about him gradually, in the way you learn a place by walking its streets rather than looking at a map. He was from Ohio originally, the second son of a schoolteacher. He had come west because the West was where things were happening, and he was the kind of person who needed to be where things were happening, or he became restless and difficult to be around, as he admitted with a frankness she admired. He had a strong sense of justice that showed in what he chose to print and what he chose to say about it, and she saw him argue with the mayor over an editorial about the treatment of the Cherokee people whose strip of land sat just south of the Kansas line, not because it was easy to argue with the mayor, but because he had decided it needed to be said. She thought about that argument for several days. The town of Caldwell sat at the very edge of Indian territory, and the relationship between the white settlement and the Cherokee and other nations to the south was a complicated and often painful one, marked by the treaties that kept being rewritten, and the land that kept being taken, and the people who kept being moved. Eli had written about it plainly, not with sentimentality but with the kind of factual moral clarity that was, she thought, the best thing a newspaper could offer. She told him so one afternoon when she stopped by the courier office to place an announcement for her father's bank. "I expected more pushback," he said. He was setting type at the compositor's table, the black ink on his hands and the rolled-up sleeves of his shirt giving him the look of a man who worked with his whole body as well as his mind. "You'll get it," she said. "You got the mayor. Others will follow." "Will they be right?" he asked. "No," she said, "but that doesn't mean they won't be loud about it." He looked at her with a quality of attention that had become, over these weeks, familiar and still capable of making her somewhat self-conscious. "You are the most directly honest person in this town," he said. "Has anyone ever told you that?" "My mother says I am too blunt," she said. "Your mother and I disagree," he said. That was the day, she thought later, that she knew she was in real trouble. Not the pleasant, theoretical trouble of noticing an attractive man, but the genuine, substantial trouble of a heart that has decided something without consulting the rest of you and is not interested in reversing its decision. She was busy enough with her own realizing that she almost missed the shift happening in him, but she was perceptive, and he was not particularly guarded, and over the next few weeks she saw it clearly. He sought her out in ways that exceeded professional necessity. He remembered things she had mentioned in passing and asked follow-up questions weeks later. He laughed more easily in her company than in anyone else's, and she knew this because she had the somewhat embarrassing habit of noticing when he laughed and with whom. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of Harvey Pittman. Harvey Pittman was a cattle broker, wealthy by Caldwell standards, 35 years old and well aware that he was wealthy by Caldwell standards. He had been paying attention to Fannie Hawkins for some time, with the possessive calculation of a man who assessed women the way he assessed livestock, looking for value and availability. He made his interest known by increasing his banking visits and addressing himself to Fannie with a familiarity that she found grating and her father found concerning. He was not a cruel man. He was not even, in most of his dealings, a dishonest one. But there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel like property being appraised, and she had been managing this with polite clarity for several months, which meant firmly declining every suggestion he made toward her company and trying to do so in a way that didn't create problems for her father's business. The Saturday of the Founders' Day celebration changed the management of this situation considerably. It was August, which meant the heat was considerable and the whole town had turned out for the festivities, which included a horse race, a pie contest, dancing in the evening, and the particular festive disorder that characterized any Caldwell celebration. Fannie was helping her mother find a shaded seat when Harvey Pittman appeared at her elbow and took hold of her arm in a way that was just firm enough to be a statement. "Miss Hawkins," he said, "I believe you promised me a dance this evening." She had promised him nothing of the kind, and they both knew it. "I believe you are confused, Mr. Pittman," she said, keeping her voice level. "I don't think so," he said, and his grip tightened marginally. "Mr. Pittman." It was Eli's voice from about 3 feet away, and it had a quality she had not heard in it before, which was a careful, quiet iron. "I believe Miss Hawkins has plans this evening." Harvey Pittman turned to look at Eli with the assessing gaze of a man determining the quality of an obstacle. He saw a newspaper editor in his shirt sleeves, no particular size or physical threat, and visibly made an assessment that underestimated several things. "This is a private conversation," he said. "Miss Hawkins doesn't appear to be having a private conversation," Eli said. He looked at Fannie with a question in his eyes that was also an offer, clear as print. "Miss Hawkins, I believe we had agreed to watch the horse race from the fence near the finish line. Shall we go?" It was a fiction. They had agreed to nothing. But it was offered so smoothly and with such confidence, and the alternative was continuing to stand with Harvey Pittman's hand on her arm, and Fannie made her choice in half a second. "Of course," she said. "I was just coming to find you." She stepped away from Pittman's grip and took Eli's offered arm, and they walked together toward the racetrack while Harvey Pittman watched them go with an expression that promised the incident was not entirely closed. When they reached the fence at the racetrack and were among the crowd, Fannie exhaled. "Thank you," she said. "He has done that before," Eli said. It was not quite a question. "He is persistent," she said, "and accustomed to getting what he wants. I can handle him." "I know you can," Eli said, and he meant it, she could tell. He was not doubting her capability. He was offering something additional, not instead. There was a difference, and she registered it. They watched the horse race standing side by side at the fence, close enough that their arms occasionally touched in the press of the crowd, and Fannie was aware of every point of contact with a precision that made it difficult to concentrate on the horses, which were admittedly very good horses. "I made up the plans," he said after the second race. "I know," she said. "I should have asked properly," he said, "instead of just assuming." "You should have," she agreed. "But it was quick thinking." "Fannie," he said, and then stopped. It was the first time he had used her first name, and they both noticed it, and neither of them addressed it, but it sat in the air between them with a particular weight. "Yes," she said. "Would you," he said, then started again. "The dancing this evening, would you attend it with me, actually with proper asking and everything arranged in advance?" She looked at him. He was looking at the empty racetrack with the expression of a man who has just said something that required some courage to say, and was now somewhat committed to the outcome. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The dancing was held in the cleared floor of the Caldwell Town Hall, and it was the kind of evening that the prairie summer occasionally bestowed upon the human beings trying to build civilization on its edges, full of fiddle music and lamplight, and the easy pleasure of a community that, despite all its roughness and its problems and its injustices, was capable of this too, capable of dancing together under the lanterns while the night air came cool off the Kansas plain. Eli was not the most accomplished dancer she had ever danced with, but he was earnest about it, and his rhythm was good, and he made her laugh twice during the first dance and 3 times during the second, and by the third dance, which was slower and put his hand warm at her waist and hers at his shoulder, she was not laughing but was engaged in a very different and more serious variety of feeling. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You always do," she said. "Fair point," he said. "Roscoe Yates." "I have heard a version of the story." She was briefly startled, but this was Eli, who made it his business to know things about the town he had come to serve. "What version?" she said. "That you asked him to the church social, that he declined." "That is accurate," she said. "The lady from Austin came," he said. "Clara," Fannie said. "Her name is Clara Webb. She is a good person." Eli was quiet for a moment, which with him always meant he was thinking rather than deciding what to say. "You drove her out to the ranch yourself," he said. "It needed doing," she said. "Most people," he said carefully, "would have been rather less generous about that." "Most people," she said, "would not have found themselves in that particular situation by their own direct action." "You asked him," Eli said. "Directly," she agreed. "It seemed better than the alternative. And he turned me down with more honesty and decency than most men manage in far easier situations, so I have no complaint about the way it was handled." "Just about the outcome," he said. "Just about the outcome," she said, because it was the truth and he would see through anything less. "For about a week. And then I thought about it, and I thought that a man who keeps his promises and guards his heart like that is not a man I should feel sorry not to have. I should feel glad he was honest." "I do feel glad." Eli looked at her. They were still dancing slowly in the warm lantern light. "You are," he said, "a remarkable person." "I have been told I am blunt," she said. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive," he said. She was quiet a moment. "What about you?" she said, because she believed in fair exchange. "Is there someone I should know about? Anyone waiting for a letter from Caldwell, Kansas?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "There was someone in St. Louis. It ended before I came west. Mutual agreement, though it wasn't easy." He paused. "She needed someone who would stay in one place. I needed somewhere that wasn't St. Louis. Neither of those things were going to change." "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "It was the right ending for the wrong reason at the time, but it was the right ending." They danced until the fiddles stopped and the lanterns began to dim, and he walked her home under the wide black Kansas sky spangled with stars, the way that sky gets when you are far enough from everything that the dark is truly dark and the stars are truly brilliant. They stood at her gate for a moment, and the night was warm and smelled of summer grass, and everything was very quiet. "I intend to call on you properly," he said. "With your father's knowledge and your mother's approval, and all the conventions followed in their proper order." "That will take time," she said. "I have time," he said. "I have taken a position at the Courier and I am not going anywhere." "My mother will want to know your family and your income and your intentions," she said. "I have a respectable family and a modest income and excellent intentions," he said. "I will present them all. She will also have opinions about the editorial you wrote about the Indian Territory situation," she said. "She and I will have a spirited conversation," he said. "I look forward to it." She laughed for what felt like the 20th time that evening and went inside. Her mother was waiting up, which Fannie had expected. "The editor," her mother said. "Good night, Mama," Fannie said. "He seems intelligent," her mother said. "Good night, Mama," Fannie said again, and went upstairs and lay in the dark with the sound of the prairie wind against the window and the warm, satisfied feeling of an evening well spent, and thought that the summer of 1879 was turning out to be considerably more interesting than she had anticipated. The following week, Eli called on her formally, presenting himself at the front door of the Hawkins house on a Sunday afternoon with his best coat and his hat in his hand. He sat in the parlor and talked with Josiah Hawkins about banking and the cattle trade and the future of Kansas, and then sat with Margaret Hawkins and answered her thorough and not entirely gentle questions with the patient clarity of a man who has nothing to hide and is not interested in pretending otherwise. Margaret Hawkins had opinions about the Indian Territory editorial. Eli had been told to expect this. He presented his reasoning carefully, and she challenged it sharply, and he did not back down from the substance of what he had written while acknowledging the legitimate complexity of the situation. And at the end of this exchange, Margaret Hawkins said, "Well, you are not a coward at least," which was, Fannie would later explain to him, the highest compliment her mother gave anyone she met for the first time. By October, Eli Calhoun was a regular and welcome presence in the Hawkins household. Harvey Pittman had not entirely abandoned his position, but a pointed conversation between him and Josiah Hawkins about the nature of his attention to Josiah's daughter had clarified certain things, and Pittman had redirected his ambitions toward a widow from Wichita who was more receptive to them, which was a satisfactory outcome for everyone. Roscoe Yates and Clara Webb were married in a quiet ceremony at the end of September, which Fannie attended with Eli at her side. She shook Clara's hand and genuinely wished her happiness, because she meant it, and she caught Roscoe's eye for a moment, and something was exchanged between them that was not regret and not awkwardness, but something more like the recognition between two people who have treated each other well in a difficult moment and can respect each other for it. Roscoe nodded to her with the same care he always did, and then looked at Eli with the particular assessment of a man looking at the person standing next to a woman he has inadvertently wronged, and seemed to conclude that the situation had resolved itself satisfactorily. "He seems like a good man," Roscoe said to her quietly, while Eli was speaking with Calvin Bellamy nearby. "He is," she said. Roscoe nodded again. "Good," he said, with a simplicity that meant considerably more than the word. The winter came down off the Kansas plain the way winters in that country have always done, which is without much ceremony and with a good deal of force. The temperature dropped through October and November, and by December the ground was frozen solid and the cattle drives had stopped for the season, and Caldwell settled into its winter pace, slower and more interior, with more time spent by fires and less time spent on the road. It was during these winter months that Fannie and Eli grew into the kind of knowing each other that goes past pleasant company and enters the territory of genuine intimacy, the kind built not from grand gestures but from ordinary time spent in each other's presence. She helped him with the Courier on Wednesday afternoons, organizing the subscription rolls and proofreading the editorials with a critical eye that he claimed to find irritating and demonstrably relied upon. He came to supper at the Hawkins house twice a week, and afterward sat with the family by the fire and talked, and gradually became a presence so woven into the household that, when he missed a Wednesday supper due to a late edition, her mother commented on the quietness of the evening. He told her things over those months that he had not told many people, about his brother back in Ohio who he had not seen in 4 years but wrote to regularly, about the thing that had happened in St. Louis that he was not specific about but that she gathered had involved a story he had published that had cost him professionally and had not cost him morally, which was a trade he had made without regret but not without loss, about the particular loneliness of arriving somewhere new and not knowing yet whether you would belong there or not. She told him things too, about the 2 years in St. Louis where she had lived a different kind of life and been a different kind of person, broader and more self-assured, and about the difficulty of coming home to find that home had become smaller, about her mother's health, which was real but also occasionally more limiting than was strictly necessary, about the gap between what she was capable of and what her circumstances offered her to do with that capability. "You should write," he said once in the middle of December when she had just produced an analysis of the upcoming county election that was sharper than anything he had in the current edition. "Write what?" she said. "For the paper," he said. "Regularly, as a contributor." She looked at him. "Women don't write for newspapers," she said. "Elizabeth Custer wrote for newspapers," he said. "Nellie Bly is writing for newspapers. It is not common, but it is not without precedent." "This is Caldwell, Kansas," she said. "Caldwell, Kansas needs a sharp analytical eye on its local politics," he said. "You have one. The convergence seems obvious to me." "My father would be horrified," she said. "Your father told me last week that you are the best mind he has in that bank and that it is a waste to have you doing only the ledgers," Eli said. She stared at him. "He said that." "He also said that if I were smart I would ask you to marry me before someone else figured it out," Eli said, and then stopped, in the way of a man who has just said something significantly more than he intended to say and has surprised himself with it. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the December wind pressed against the windows. Fannie looked at him with the direct clarity that was her natural mode and said, "And are you smart?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then he set down the newspaper proof he had been holding and turned to face her properly. "I am trying to do this correctly," he said. "There is an order to these things. Your father, your mother, the ring, the proper occasion." "There is," she agreed. "And I have every intention of following that order," he said. "But," she said. "But I find that I am completely in love with you," he said, with the directness of a man who writes for a living and has run out of oblique approaches. "And it is taking some effort not to simply say so every time I see you, which has become a practical impediment to normal conversation." Fannie Hawkins looked at the man across from her, this Ohio schoolteacher's son who had come west to write about the world, and had walked into her life bandaged and one-handed on a prairie road with a horse named Daisy and opinions about novels and the moral clarity to publish things that needed publishing and the honesty to say what he felt when he finally said it, and felt something settle in her chest with the particular solidity of something true. "Eli," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been in love with you since the first Wednesday you got the preacher's argument wrong and refused to admit it," she said. He blinked. "I wasn't wrong about that," he said. "You were entirely wrong," she said. "I was presenting an alternative interpretation," he said. "That was incorrect," she said. "I still maintain," he began. "Eli," she said. "Yes," he said. "Stop arguing and come here," she said. He crossed the room to her and took both her hands in his, the ink-stained, careful hands of a man who worked with words, and looked at her with an expression that she thought she would be happy looking at for the rest of her life. "I will ask your father tomorrow," he said. "He will say yes," she said. "He told you to ask me." "There is still a proper form to it," he said. "There is," she agreed. "I respect that you are following it." He kissed her then once, gently, in the way of a man making a promise. The spring of 1880 arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, the way spring arrives on the Kansas plain, in a sudden, extravagant rush of green that makes you forget it had ever been winter, the grass coming up impossibly fast, and the sky going that deep, particular blue that seems almost unreal. The cattle drive started again from the south, and the town filled back up with drovers and commerce, and the Caldwell Courier published its spring edition with a new regular feature, local commentary and political analysis by F. Hawkins, which created considerable discussion and was received with more enthusiasm than Fannie had expected and about as much resistance as Eli had predicted. Harvey Pittman wrote a letter to the editor objecting to a female contributor. Eli published it alongside a response from 3 other readers who disagreed with Pittman, which Fannie felt was the appropriate editorial approach. Eli Calhoun asked Josiah Hawkins for his daughter's hand on a Saturday morning in March, in the proper form, with the proper gravity, and Josiah said yes in the time it takes to say the word. Margaret Hawkins wept, which she would have found embarrassing if asked about it later. Fannie's younger sister, who was 16 and therefore enchanted by the whole proceeding, told everyone at her school. They were married in May, in the Caldwell church that Fannie had attended her entire life, on a morning when the prairie air was warm and smelled of wildflowers, and the sky was exactly the blue of a Kansas spring. She wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her, with new ribbons, and she carried a small bunch of the wildflowers from the field behind her parents' house. Eli stood at the altar and watched her come down the aisle with an expression that her father would later describe as the look of a man who cannot quite believe his own good fortune, which was both accurate and endearing. Roscoe Yates was in attendance with Clara, who was expecting their first child and radiant with it. He caught Fannie's eye as she walked past and nodded to her, and she smiled back. And that was the complete and final accounting of a story that had begun in a saloon on a Tuesday morning in July, and ended exactly as it should, with both parties exactly where they belonged. The ceremony was followed by a celebration that encompassed most of Caldwell and lasted well into the evening, with the fiddles and the dancing and the long tables of food that the women of the town had spent 2 days producing. Eli danced with her until she laughed and told him his rhythm was still imperfect, and he said that it had been imperfect when he had danced with her at the Founders' Day celebration, and she had not complained then, and she said that was because she had been too distracted to notice, and he said he was choosing to consider that a compliment. They moved into a house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from her parents', which was close enough for convenience and far enough for independence, a balance Fannie had thought carefully about. It was a plain house, wood-framed and practical, with a good kitchen and a parlor wide enough for a desk, because Eli had a desk in the parlor and Fannie had a desk beside it, and this arrangement was perhaps the most honest physical expression of the marriage they were building, 2 people working side by side with enough room for each of them to be fully what they were. She continued writing for the Courier. He continued editing it. They argued about her editorials regularly, which was both professionally productive and personally enjoyable, since they had both discovered early on that arguing with each other was one of their more pleasurable shared activities. In the late summer of 1880, Fannie Hawkins Calhoun discovered she was expecting. She told Eli on a warm August evening, sitting on the porch of the Elm Street house while the last light went off the Kansas sky. His expression was the one she had come to think of as purely his, the one where every thought he was having moved across his face in a quick, unguarded sequence before he settled into one thing, and the thing he settled into was a joy so obvious and undefended that it made her eyes sting. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am very sure," she said. He took her hand, held it, looked at the darkening sky over the prairie. "A Calhoun in Kansas," he said. "Several, eventually," she said. "One at a time," he said, but he was smiling with his whole face. The baby arrived in April of 1881, with the winter properly behind them and the spring coming in strong and green. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with Eli's dark hair and Fannie's particular expression of determined assessment, which he wore almost immediately and would apparently be keeping. They named him James Josiah Calhoun, for Eli's Ohio brother and Fannie's father, and both men were pleased and proud about this in their different ways. Josiah Hawkins held his grandson with the careful, slightly formal tenderness of a man who has not held an infant in many years, but is not going to admit uncertainty about it. And Eli watched this from the doorway of the bedroom with an expression that Fannie, even through her considerable exhaustion, found so warm that she reached for his hand. "You are a father," she said. "I am," he said, somewhat awed. "I had been told this would happen, and yet it is still startling." "You wrote about it," she reminded him. 3 months previous, he had written a brief, uncharacteristically personal editorial about the impending addition to the Calhoun household, which had prompted more reader correspondence than anything else he had published. "Writing about something is different from the thing itself," he said. "That is the most honest thing you have ever said," she said. The Caldwell Courier continued to grow under Eli's editorship through the early 1880s, expanding its coverage as Caldwell itself expanded, the town pressing outward along the cattle trade routes and drawing in more settlers and merchants, and people making their bet on the future of Kansas. Fannie's column became a fixture, her readership loyal and her opinions well known, which made her both influential and occasionally controversial, which she considered an acceptable trade. Roscoe and Clara Yates had their son in November of 1880, a red-faced, vigorous boy they named Tom. Roscoe had earned enough by then to start his own small operation, a dozen head of cattle on leased land to the east, and Calvin Bellamy had helped him negotiate the arrangement with the goodwill of a man investing in someone he trusted. He was building something, steadily and without fanfare, the way he did everything. Clara was happy in a quiet and complete way that was visible in everything about her. Fannie and Clara had become, in the intervening years, genuine friends, which was one of the outcomes she had not predicted and was glad of. They were different women in most respects, Clara quiet where Fannie was direct, domestic where Fannie was civic, but they found an easy understanding in each other that had grown from that buggy ride and had been confirmed in every subsequent meeting. "You were kind to me when you had no reason to be," Clara said once, when they were sitting together on Fanny's porch with the babies asleep inside. "I have never forgotten that. I had every reason to be," Fanny said. "You were a stranger who needed help, that is reason enough." "You know what I mean," Clara said. "I do," Fanny said, "and I am glad it has all turned out as it has. I would not change a thing." And she meant it, with the full conviction of a person who has ended up precisely where she belongs and knows it. She looked at her life with clear eyes and found it good. Not without difficulty, not without the ordinary weight of sorrow that attaches itself to any real life, but genuinely, substantially good. In the fall of 1881, Eli received a letter from his brother James in Ohio, the first in some months, and read it at the kitchen table while Fanny was feeding young Jamie, who was 6 months old and deeply opinionated about the process. The letter was long, and Eli read it twice. "He is talking about coming west," Eli said. "Your brother," Fanny said. "He has been thinking about it for a while, he says. Teaching school in Ohio is not what he wanted at 28. "What did he want?" she asked. "Something more," Eli said and smiled. "He is very like me in some ways, restless, needs to be where things are happening." "Tell him to come then," Fanny said. "Caldwell could use a good school teacher." Eli wrote back that evening, a long letter in the expressive hand that Fanny had come to love, the handwriting of a person who thought in full sentences and wrote as fast as he thought. And at the bottom, she added a postscript saying that the Kansas sky was worth seeing, and the town was growing, and the position at the school had been vacant since spring. James Calhoun arrived in Caldwell in March of 1882, carrying a trunk of books that exceeded in number and weight everything else he owned, and took one look at the wide, flat, endless sky of the Kansas plain and said to his brother, standing in the main street with the March wind pulling at both their hats, "You were right. This is somewhere things happen." He was hired by the school board within a week, and within a month he was established as a thorough and gifted teacher, firm but patient, with the particular quality of making children understand that learning was not an obligation imposed on them, but a power they were being given, which was the attitude that made a good teacher rather than merely a competent one. He also, within that same month, found himself spending a good deal of time in the company of Millie Fenwick, the 20-year-old daughter of the hardware merchant, who had the kind of quick intelligence that had been somewhat wasted behind the hardware counter, and who had read every book in the small lending library 3 times over by the time James Calhoun arrived with his trunk full of new ones. Fanny observed this development with considerable satisfaction and a diplomatic silence that she managed for almost 3 weeks before saying to Eli, "Your brother is very obvious when he is trying not to be obvious." "He is," Eli agreed. "I believe he comes by it honestly." "You were not obvious," she said. "You were thorough." "I was extremely obvious," he said. "Half the town knew before I had said anything." "Dollars Finch knew," she said. "She doesn't count, she knows everything." The winter of 1882 was mild by Kansas standards, which meant it was merely cold rather than punishing, and the town settled into its indoor season with the stored warmth of a busy year. The Courier published its year-end edition, which Fanny wrote a substantial portion of, a retrospective of Caldwell's growth that was also, implicitly, a love letter to a place she had come to fully claim as her own. She had not always loved it here. She had come back from St. Louis with the feeling of being reduced, of a world contracting around her, and that feeling had been real and had been hard. But the world had not contracted. The world had been here all along, this particular piece of it, the cattle drives and the frontier commerce and the complicated living together of people trying to build something under the enormous Kansas sky, and she had not been looking at it correctly until she had had reasons to look at it differently. Eli had been one reason. Her son had been another. The work at the Courier had been another still. The friendship of Clara Yates and the respect of her father, and the increasing sense that what she was doing here mattered, that the words she put on the page in the Courier office were read by people who thought about them, and were sometimes changed by them, that a woman's voice in the public conversation of a frontier town was not an imposition but a contribution. These things had changed her relationship to this place, and she looked at Caldwell, Kansas, in the December of 1882, and found it home in the complete sense of the word. She found this out very clearly on the December evening when a letter arrived from a women's college in Missouri, addressed to Fannie Calhoun, expressing interest in whether she might consider submitting work for a broader publication they were establishing, having seen her column reprinted in a Kansas City paper that winter. It was a genuine, unexpected invitation to a larger platform, and she read it twice and then set it on the table beside the lamp. Eli came in from the courier late, ink-stained as always, and found her reading it a third time. "What is that?" he said. She handed it to him. He read it. Read it again. His expression went through several things. "Fannie," he said. "I know," she said. "I know," she said again. "You could have a column read by 1,000 people instead of 100, he said. "I could," she said, "if I wanted it." He looked at her steadily. "Do you?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. She looked at her life from the inside, its actual contours, the warmth of the Elm Street house and the noise of young Jamie, who was almost a year old now and had recently learned to pull himself to standing and was extremely pleased about this. The Wednesday afternoons at the courier office and the Saturday mornings at the market and the Sunday dinners at her parents' house and the view of the Kansas sky from her own front porch. "I want to write for them," she said. "I want to submit something and see. But I do not want to leave here." Something in Eli's expression settled, and she saw it settle, and she understood that he had been holding himself carefully while he waited for her answer. "You don't have to," he said. "A column can go by post. Distance doesn't have to mean departure." "No," she said, "it doesn't." She submitted a piece to the Missouri publication in January of 1883. They published it in March, and the response exceeded what anyone had anticipated, and they asked for another, and then another, and Fannie Calhoun became one of the small number of women writing regular commentary for publication beyond the borders of her home state, which was a thing she had not planned and had not anticipated, and had come to her sideways through a prairie road, and a wounded newspaper editor, and a love story that had started as something else entirely. She wrote to them from the desk beside her husband's desk in the parlor of the Elm Street house, with young Jamie playing on the floor between them and the Kansas wind against the windows. And this was, she thought, almost exactly as good as anything could be. The spring of 1883 brought news from Ohio that Eli's father had passed after a brief illness, which struck Eli in the quiet, deep way that the deaths of parents strike even when they come with some warning, and at the end of a long life. He was sadder than he let most people see, and Fannie was one of the few people permitted to see it fully, which she considered a privilege of the particular kind that only intimacy grants. She sat with him on the porch on the evening they received the word, and there was nothing useful to say about death, so she did not say anything, but held his hand in the late spring dark while the prairie settled into its nighttime quiet around them, and he talked about his father, the school teacher, and what he had taught and what he had been, and after a while he was quiet again, and then after a while longer he said, "He would have liked you." "I would have liked him," she said. "He would have argued with your editorials," Eli said. "Good," she said. "I need more readers who argue." He laughed, which was what she had hoped for, the small particular laugh that meant he was still himself even inside the grief. James Calhoun and Millie Fenwick were married the following autumn, in the same Caldwell church where Eli and Fannie had married 3 years before. James looked exactly like his brother had looked at the altar, which was the look of a man who cannot believe his own fortune, and Millie, in her cream-colored dress, looked precisely like a woman who is bringing a great deal of intelligence and warmth to a project she has committed to fully. Fannie and Eli sat in the front pew with young Jamie between them, who was 2½ and well-behaved for approximately 15 minutes before requiring some management. "He has your stubbornness," Eli whispered. "He has your attention span," she whispered back. "Fair," he said. By the winter of 1883, the Calhoun household was a well-established institution on Elm Street, marked by the steady production of the Courier and the regular appearance of Fannie's column and the growing and cheerful presence of Jamie, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's direct gaze, and showed every indication of having both their intellectual temperaments, which was either going to be wonderful or extremely challenging, and probably both. On a cold January evening, with the snow coming down outside in the particular way that Kansas snow comes down, which is horizontal rather than vertical due to the wind, Eli came in from the Courier with cold, reddened hands and the bright look he sometimes got when he had been thinking about something important. He took off his coat and sat down at the kitchen table across from Fannie, who was nursing their second child, a girl they had named Margaret after Fannie's mother, who was 8 weeks old and had from the first day of her life been distinctly and formidably herself. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking about the paper," he said. "About expanding it, going from weekly to twice weekly, maybe hiring a second compositor, eventually a reporter. That takes capital," she said. "Your father and I have been talking," he said. She looked at him. "He is interested in investing," Eli said. "He believes the Courier is a sound enterprise and he wants to support it. He was actually quite direct about it." "He would be," she said. "He has always been direct." "I know where you get it from," Eli said. "What is the plan exactly?" She said, because she was the bookkeeper's daughter and she liked plans to have specific numbers. He laid it out for her completely and carefully, the way he laid out everything, and she asked questions and he answered them, and they spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with baby Margaret asleep in her arms and the snow outside and the lamp burning between them, working through the figures and the timeline and the practical steps, and it was one of the most comfortable evenings she could remember, which told her something about what she had built with this man. The working through of things together was not a burden. It was one of the pleasures. The expansion plan was agreed upon and begun in the spring, and by the summer of 1884, the Caldwell Courier was publishing twice a week and had added a young reporter named Tom Briggs, fresh from a journalism course in Kansas City, who was enthusiastic and inexperienced and learned fast. Roscoe Yates, now the owner of a herd of respectable size and a small but solid piece of land, stopped Eli in the street one July morning to subscribe to both editions. "Your wife's column on the water rights question last month," Roscoe said. "It changed how I thought about it." "Tell her that," Eli said. "She will appreciate hearing it directly." "She was right about the county commissioners," Roscoe said. "She usually is," Eli said, with the comfortable pride of a man who has entirely stopped being surprised by his wife's rightness, which is different from having expected it and is, in some ways, better. Fannie did hear it from Roscoe directly at the following Sunday's service and thanked him with genuine warmth. She looked at him, this quiet, steady man who had once briefly been the object of her incomplete and misguided attention, and felt nothing but goodwill, which was the cleanest and most satisfying confirmation that the story had gone exactly as it should. Beside her, Eli had his hand at the small of her back in the easy proprietary way of a husband who is also very much a person in love, and she leaned into it slightly, and Roscoe, who was perceptive, saw this and smiled. "You are happy," he said simply. "Very," she said. "Good," he said, with the weight of genuine gladness in it. The autumn of 1884 brought a piece of news that Fannie wrote about with all the care she could muster, which was that the U.S. government was once again under pressure to open portions of the unassigned lands just south of the Kansas line for settlement, the lands that had been guaranteed by treaty to various nations and were increasingly threatened by the pressure of westward expansion. It was a story that Eli had been covering from multiple angles: the political maneuvering in Washington, the testimony of the people whose land it was, the economic interests pushing against their rights. It was complicated and it was important, and it was the kind of story that the Caldwell Courier covered because Eli Calhoun had decided from the beginning that a newspaper's job was to tell people what they needed to know even when it was not comfortable, and Fannie shared this conviction with the full weight of her convictions behind it. Some readers canceled their subscriptions. More wrote to say they were glad the paper was honest about it. Eli printed all the letters, for and against. "You know what is going to happen to that land," she said one evening when they had been reading the latest dispatch from Washington. "Yes," he said. "And we will keep writing about it," she said. "Yes," he said, "for as long as it matters." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers briefly, the way you touch someone to say "I am with you in this," which was a thing that words sometimes can't carry as precisely. In January of 1885, Tom Briggs came to Eli with a story about financial irregularities at the county courthouse that he had been quietly investigating for 3 months. It was solid, documented, and it named 2 county officials directly. Publishing it would cause significant disruption and create enemies. Eli read it again, set it down, looked at Fannie, who was in the office that afternoon, and said, "What do you think?" She read it carefully. "It is accurate," she said to Tom. "Every word," Tom said. "I have the documents." "Then publish it," she said. "The backlash will be real," Eli said. "The backlash for not publishing it would be your conscience," she said, "which I have some experience with, and I can tell you it is a more persistent problem." He smiled. "Publish it," he said to Tom. The backlash was real. It was also, in time, productive. Both officials were removed from their positions by the following spring, and the county's financial management improved, and the Caldwell Courier was discussed in the Kansas City papers as an example of rigorous local journalism, which Tom Briggs was enormously pleased about and which Eli received with his characteristic quiet satisfaction. Fannie, writing her column about the outcome, felt the particular pleasure of work that mattered. She had learned over these years in Caldwell that meaningful work and meaningful love were not in competition. They fed each other. They made each other larger. The love she had for Eli gave her a place to stand, and from that place she could reach further than she could have reached from anywhere else. She thought sometimes, briefly, about the Tuesday morning in the Silver Spur saloon, the blue dress, the moment of refusal, the hand pressed against a breast pocket, protecting something. She thought about the way a story that looked like an ending had been a beginning in a direction she could not have anticipated. If Roscoe Yates had not been a man who kept his promises, she would not have ridden east on that road. She would not have found an editor with ink-stained hands and a horse named Daisy and a desire to be where things happened. She would not have sat in that parlor arguing about novels and found someone who not only wanted to argue back but needed to, the way she did, not out of antagonism, but out of the genuine pleasure of 2 minds working hard against each other. She was grateful for it. All of it, the path that looked like it led nowhere and turned out to lead here, to this house on Elm Street with the lamplight in the windows and the sound of children, and the desk beside the desk, and the wide Kansas sky visible from every window, infinite and blue. In the summer of 1885, Jamie Calhoun, who was 4 years old and had his mother's conviction and his father's vocabulary, announced at the supper table that he intended to write for the paper when he grew up. Eli looked at Fannie. Fannie looked at Eli. "You can start by setting type," Eli said. "It builds discipline." "Will you teach me?" Jamie said. "When you are older," Eli said. "How much older?" "Considerably," Fannie said. "That is not specific," Jamie said, which was so precisely the kind of thing she herself said that Eli had to look at his plate for a moment. Margaret, who was 18 months and intensely opinionated, banged her spoon on the table in what appeared to be agreement, which started Jamie laughing, which started everyone else, and the table was loud and warm and full of the specific noise of a family that argues and laughs and is well and happy. Fannie looked at her husband across the table, through the noise and the warmth and the lamplight, and he looked back at her, and what passed between them was not a grand thing, not dramatic, but the deep, steady, particular thing that is only available to people who have spent years building something together and know the weight and quality of what they have built. It was love in its fullest form, which is not the beginning thing, the dizzying and uncertain thing, though that had been real and good. It was the form that comes after, the one made of accumulated days and arguments, and working through the figures at the kitchen table, and sitting in the dark not saying anything and saying exactly the right thing, and being wrong sometimes, and being right and growing in directions neither of you could have predicted. She had not found it the way she had planned. She had found it on a road by accident, when she was driving in the wrong direction for the wrong reasons. And she had found it because a good man had been honest with her about where his heart already lived, and because she had been honest enough with herself to drive away from his gate with her chin up and keep going toward whatever was next. The autumn of 1885 was golden and long, the way Kansas autumns occasionally and magnificently are, the grass going amber and the sky that particular deep blue that seems to deepen as the air cools, and the whole wide country glowing in the particular light of late September. Fannie sat on the porch of the Elm Street house on a Saturday afternoon while the children napped and Eli was at the courier office finishing the week's edition, and she watched the light move across the Kansas plain, and she thought about what it meant to be in the place you are supposed to be. She had grown up here and left and come back. She had aimed at one thing and arrived at another. She had been turned away from one door and walked through a different one she had not even known was there. She had built something, word by word and day by day, a life in a place that was rough and beautiful and imperfect and real, and she had built it alongside a person who was rough and capable and imperfect and real, and she would not have traded any of it. Eli came home just before supper, as he usually did when he was not late with an addition, and he came up onto the porch and stood behind her chair and put his hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and put her hands over his, and they were both quiet for a moment, looking at the same sky. "Good week?" she asked. "Very," he said. "Tom has a piece on the new cattle association that is excellent. Better than what I would have written at his age." "That is what you want," she said. "Someone better than you were." "It is," he said. "How was yours?" "I finished the water rights column," she said, "and Jamie set 2 lines of type without my help." "That seems early," he said. "It is early," she agreed. "He has your determination about things." "He has your determination about things," Eli said. "I merely persist. You are determined." "The difference being," she said. "Persistence is about stubbornness," he said. "Determination is about conviction. One is a quality, the other is a virtue." She turned to look up at him, and he was looking down at her with the particular expression she had loved for 6 years, the one that was warm and certain and a little amused and completely present. "You are going to write a column about that distinction, aren't you?" she said. "I was thinking about it," he admitted. "It is mine," she said. "You haven't written it yet," he said. "It is still mine," she said. "I thought of it first." "You thought of it because I said it," he said. "Inspiration is not the same as authorship," she said. "That is exactly the kind of distinction a person makes when they are about to steal your column idea," he said. She laughed, and he sat down beside her on the porch, and the light went gold across the Kansas plain, and the children woke up inside and started making themselves audible, and supper needed starting, and the edition needed finishing, and the week would end and a new one would begin with its news and its arguments and its small, steady accumulations of a life well lived. In the spring of 1886, Fannie Calhoun was 30 years old. Eli was 33. They had been married 6 years, which was not a long time by most measures and felt, from the inside, like a length of time that was also the right length of time, full enough to be substantial and still containing more ahead than behind. She wrote on the morning of her birthday, as she wrote on most mornings, sitting at her desk with the early light coming through the east window and the sounds of the household beginning around her. She was writing the spring editorial for the Courier, which would also go by post to the Missouri publication, and from there, she had recently learned, was occasionally reprinted further east, which still surprised her when she thought about it directly. The words were about Caldwell and Kansas and the particular quality of a frontier life, the way it demanded something real from the people who lived it and gave something real in return, not safety or ease, but a kind of honesty about what mattered, about what work was worth doing, and what love was worth having, and what community meant when you were building it from the ground up without the comfortable scaffolding of established civilization. She wrote about what it meant to be a woman in this place at this time, the limitations that were real and the spaces that were also real, the ways the frontier both constrained and opened, and how the opening was worth fighting for and the constraining was worth naming honestly. She wrote about what she had learned from living here, which was that a life of substance required both love and work, and that both were forms of the same commitment, which was showing up fully for something bigger than yourself and doing it day after day with whatever you had. Eli read the finished column that evening and was quiet for a moment after. "This is the best thing you have written," he said. "Since last month," she said. "No," he said, "just the best thing." She looked at him. "You should know that," he said. "Not because it will go further or be reprinted more widely, though it probably will, but because it is true and you deserve to hear true things." "I generally get true things from you," she said. "I generally give them," he said. "It is my best quality." "It is one of several," she said. He smiled, the full smile, the one that came out entirely when he was not managing his expression at all, and she thought, as she sometimes thought, that she would like to memorize it, the exact quality of it, so that she would always have it accurately in mind. "Happy birthday," he said. "Thank you," she said. 30, he said. "You can say it," she said. "I have no concerns about 30. "I know," he said. "You have always known where you were going." She thought about this. "Not always," she said. "I thought I knew where I was going on a Tuesday morning in July of 1879, and I was entirely wrong." "And are you sorry?" he said. "No," she said. "I am the opposite of sorry." "What is the opposite of sorry?" he said. "Glad," she said simply. "Just glad." He reached across the desk and took her hand, and they sat together in the lamplight of the Elm Street house, while the spring dark settled over Caldwell, Kansas, and the wind came soft off the prairie through the open window, and the children were asleep upstairs, and the courier sat ready to be delivered in the morning, and the wide, indifferent, beautiful sky was full of stars over the same country where she had grown up and left and come back to and claimed fully as hers. Outside, somewhere down the street, a fiddle was playing from one of the saloons, an old familiar tune that carried easily through the warm night air, and Fannie Calhoun listened to it and thought that the wild, rough, building, imperfect, magnificent country around her was exactly the right place for the life she was living, and that the life she was living was exactly the right one. She thought about a cowboy with a letter close to his heart, and the honesty to say no when it would have been easier not to. She thought about a road and a fence post, and a man with an injured hand and a horse with an inappropriate name. She thought about ink-stained fingers and arguments about novels and a hand warm at her waist while the fiddles played at a Founder's Day dance. She thought about all the ways a story can begin, and how often the beginning looks nothing like what it is. She was glad for all of it. She was glad for it down to the root of her. The lamp burned warm between them, and the Kansas night settled deep and wide around the house on Elm Street, and Fannie Hawkins Calhoun held her husband's hand across the desk where they worked side by side, and the story of her life stretched out ahead of her, full and known and full of the particular kind of hope that comes not from not knowing what is ahead, but from trusting what you have built to carry you there. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.